Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening and welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Kitty Clark Stevenson, and I'm the chair of the Arlington Human Rights Commission. And we welcome you to our outreach event this evening. We thank you for joining us for the reception and hope you had an opportunity to share those treats and eats. And we would like to thank everyone that participated in helping to make that a reality. So now I will invite our board liaison to the mic. He will be followed by our vice chair, Roland Watkins, and then he will put you in the hands of Tiffany. Please.
Thank you very much, Kitty. As Kitty indicated, I'm John Weistat of the Arlington County Board, and you know, there's 5 of us, and we're elected at large, so we all represent the same 225,000 people all over Arlington. And when when there's a new board member, we go into a room and we divide up various boards and commissions. There's about 40 or 45 different advisory boards and commissions in Arlington that advise and inform the Arlington County Board and the Arlington County Manager on all sorts of issues. There's a housing commission, a transportation commission. One of the most popular commissions is the Advisory Commission on Towing. And so there is a commission for everything under the sun, and I was very happy shortly after I took office to be asked if I wanted to be the liaison to the Disability Advisory Commission, and I said yes very eagerly. You have, we see all the commissions and how they work and who their leadership is and so forth. And the Human Rights Commission under Kitty Clark Stevenson has really taken the commission to a whole new level. So I want to give her in particular a big hand. And Raul Torres, our Assistant County Manager, Roland Watkins, the Vice Chair of the Human Rights Commission. Just reflecting back a little bit on the last meeting like this that the Human Rights Commission had, it was just back in January, where they sponsored a forum on affordable and fair housing down at the Arlington Mill Community Center back in January. And I don't know if any of you were able to attend that, but that was a very informative and lively gathering as well. And I'm sure that they're going to be looking for additional topics in the future to really get the commission out into different Arlington neighborhoods and inform the community as to all the good work that they do. Let me just rattle off a couple of programs and kind of set the stage here in terms of Arlington County's commitment to mental health. There's a lot of services that the county provides that are very visible. Housing, transportation, education, physical health care, and so forth. But mental health is often hidden. You can't see it. It's remarkable the array of mental health services that Arlington County does have. Could we always do better? Absolutely. But we have a pretty strong commitment to mental health services in this county. And let me just rattle off a few of them. We've got emergency mental health services, Clarendon House. How many of you have been to Clarendon House, which is a physical home in Clarendon that provides day services for the mentally ill? We have various community support team services. We have discharge planning if somebody is getting out of an institution to reintegrate them back into the community, supportive housing if they need housing. Employment services, we're going to hear about Job Avenue tonight, which is a very well-regarded service for employment. Homeless case management services and treatment on wheels, or TOW, tow. We have jail diversion. It's really no secret that a lot of the residents in our jail have mental health issues. And so there are services in the jail on a daily basis to help the residents of the jail cope with their daily living. We also have a project called Projects in Assistance for Transition from Homelessness, or PATH. Program of Assertive Community Treatment, or PACT, P-A-C-T. You know, there's all these great acronyms. We also have psychiatric services, that involve an actual medical doctor, a psychiatrist, as opposed to a psychologist. And then finally, as I actually mentioned a second or two ago, we have residential services, transition team services, and let's not forget kids. We have a very robust support service team for children's mental health programs as well. And let me close by asking, is there anybody from the Community Services Board here, or CSB? Okay, are you on the Community Services Board?
I work for them.
Okay, great. It's very important to recognize the Community Services Board, which is a citizen-appointed, it's another one of our boards and commissions, basically, and it's called the Community Services Board, and they deal with social services, including mental health services and mental health support on an advocacy basis. So that wraps it up for me. I look forward to hearing from all the panelists. Thank you very much. And let me just put in a plug here that if any of you choose to kick up your Arlington involvement another notch, reach out to the county board, go on the arlingtonva.us website, and look at all the boards and commissions that you can get involved in, because it's really a very lengthy and fascinating group of volunteer outlets for you. So thank you very much to Kitty and Raul and Roland, Tiffany, everybody else tonight, and let's hear from our panelists. Thanks again.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Roland Watkins, and I'm Vice Chair of the Human Rights Commission. The main task, of course, as the Human Rights Commission is to deal with the Arlington County Anti-Discrimination Statute. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Arlington County law, in Arlington County, it is unlawful to discriminate because of race, national origin, color, marital status, sex, religion, disability, sexual orientation, or family status. And that is interpreted as being pregnant or having children pretty much under age 18. It is also illegal to retaliate against any person who opposes discriminatory practices. It is also illegal to discriminate in the sale, rental, or financing of housing or commercial real estate, the provisions and public accommodations, applications for or offers of credit, employment in private education institutions, and in employment. And it is the job of the Human Rights Commission to handle any complaints which individuals may file in which they allege they have been discriminated against for any one of pretty much those above reasons. Now, we rely as members of the Commission very much on the work of the Office of Human Rights. And the Office of Human Rights is headed by Raul Torres, and his staff is pretty much here. They've been introduced to you by Kitty. The Office of Human Rights has the responsibility of ensuring that the Arlington community and its government organizations are free of discrimination and that they are accessible to persons with disability and limited English proficiency. So the Office of Human Rights will help resolve complaints, and they also monitor affirmative action practices of the various private entities in the county. That is, in a nutshell, pretty much what the Commission actually does. Now what I want to do is to turn it over to Tiffany, who's going to introduce the panel members.
give Roland, our vice chair, a big round of applause. A little shorter here, so. Before I make introductions, I just want to give a short statement about why we're doing this tonight. There's a quote that really guided the development of this panel. It is from former President Bill Clinton. It is, "Mental illness is nothing to be ashamed of, but stigma and bias shame us all." Every year, over 42 million American adults suffer from mental illness. This is nearly 1 in 5. Tonight, with this distinguished panel beside me, we're going to examine the significant impact that mental illness can have on a person's employment and housing, as well as the impact of mental illness on employers, the workplace, and the economy. We'll also explore strategies that individuals and others can implement to lessen this impact. And near the end of the program, we're going to break for a pairs discussion, followed by Q&A. But if you have a question sooner, I encourage you to come on up to the mic and the panel will attempt to answer it for you. So I want to take a brief moment to introduce the panelists, and the full bios are in the materials outside the door, but the short bios I'll give here. First, we have Jose Campos, and he is the director of The Job Avenue and holds a Master of Social Work degree from Virginia Commonwealth University. The Job Avenue is a program of Arlington County Community Services Board, and it provides employment services to individuals challenged with a serious mental illness. Next, we have, at the end, we have Bethany Lilly. She is a policy attorney for the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. Bethany works primarily on federal policy impacting people with mental illnesses, with a special focus on Medicaid, community integration, and employment services. Next to Jose, we have Clare Miller. Clare has served as the director of the Partnership for Workplace Mental Health since 2003. The partnership is a program of the American Psychiatric Foundation and collaborates with employers to advance effective approaches to mental health. And finally, we have Theresa Nguyen. Theresa is Director of Policy and Programming for Mental Health America, and her areas of special interest include serious mental illness, early intervention, education, and building a full recovery-oriented mental health system of care. And along with supporting their organization's federal and state policy agenda, Theresa manages various programs, including workplace wellness, which we'll hear more about. So let's get right to it. You heard a bit about the Arlington Human Rights Ordinance from our vice chair. So I want to primarily direct this to Bethany, but everyone feel free to jump in. Bethany, can you tell us what is a mental illness, and does the law afford individuals with mental illness protection?
So I think I'll start with the second part of that question. Does the law afford individuals with mental illness protection? Just because I know we're getting into a discussion about how society sees mental illness, and I think defining mental illness is kind of a fundamental part of that. But to start generally, individuals with mental illness do have protections under not just the Arlington County Ordinance, but also under a lot of federal laws. I'd say that probably the most well-known one is the Americans with Disabilities Act, especially the Americans with Disabilities Act as amended by the Americans with Disabilities Amendment Act of 2008, which broadened the definition of the disabilities covered by the ADA. In addition to that, we have Section 504 of the Rehab Act of '73, which was the first step towards protecting the rights of people with disabilities. And other civil rights laws since the ADA and since the Rehab Act have been enacted with specific protections for people with disabilities. One that a lot of people don't know about it would be, for instance, the Air Carriers Access Act, which grants individuals with disabilities certain rights under air travel. For instance, bringing along service animals on planes. Another one would be the Fair Housing Act, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in the program.
So,
going back to
the question, so what is a mental illness?
Oh, I can let you go with that.
Well, I'll just chime in a little bit just to start mixing it up early here. So mental illness is, I think, sometimes a confusing term because it's really, two words that really defines a huge number of different specific illnesses. So under that rubric of mental illness, you have conditions like depression, schizophrenia, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, conditions that affect people as, children, working age adults, as well as the elderly. So it really comprises really a large number of different specific conditions. And I think that's relevant in part because they all manifest themselves differently and they all affect people differently. And even beyond that, depression can affect people differently. Men and women sometimes experience symptoms very differently. And so the way that they look to society, I think, really depends on so many different factors that it's really, it starts out as this very broad term, mental illness, but there's so many factors that kind of layer in that I think, quite frankly, in some ways perpetuate the stigma because it's just so darn confusing, and can perpetuate just this spirit of, the unknown, So,
do you want to?
I would just say that I think that that's completely right. I mean, when you're looking, if we were to ask the audience who they thought of when they think of people with mental illness, I bet we'd get a lot of different answers, especially if you have people in your life or if you personally have experienced a mental health condition. It's going to be a very different picture but from person to person to person.
And so we're talking about employment and housing tonight, so mental illness is protected in those contexts, correct? Mm-hmm. All right, so let's set the scene a little bit more. You touched on the word stigma. I want to hear from all of you about how is mental illness viewed by society and what impact does that have on an individual with mental illness? Jose?
Just want to thank the Commission for inviting us all here. I'm looking forward to learning and sharing my experience. I've been working with the county now for over 25 years. And I'm just happy to be invited to this panel, like I was saying, and looking forward to learn a lot. I must say that empowering individuals and giving hope to individuals with mental illness is very dear to my heart. And that's something that I'm very proud to be able to do and represent them in the community, and happy to work for a county that has invested a lot of resources in providing comprehensive services, as you have heard from the board member. And but I want to approach this a little bit different because I think we have made a lot of progress in mental health, but I think we still have long ways to go. And I just want you to join me. I'm going to invite you to do a little mental exercise. And you don't have to share whatever thoughts you have, but I was thinking about that one way to look at this is by thinking you in a situation that will make you think about mental illness. For instance, suppose that you heard that a person with mental illness was moving next to your house. What kind of thoughts and what kind of things would go to your mind? Let's just think about that. Or you just learn at your job site that somebody with mental illness was going to join your team. What kind of things would go through your mind? Or your daughter calls you. She has joined college first year, second year, and she's telling you that her roommate has mental illness and she takes medication. Think about those things. And I would bet that in the general population, those thoughts will probably elicit a sense of fear, violence, people that are different than me, and it is not what I experienced in my years of working with this population. The reality is that people with this condition or users of mental health services are living among us. They are working in the communities. I go around in my job and see people serving sandwiches, putting my groceries away, taking care of our children, working in churches, working for the federal government, doctors, and not what we normally think. Also, people think that people with mental illness, they don't want to work, they are violent, and they are all homeless. And that's not the case that I know. I know there are some, but there are reasons for it. Maybe we'll be talking about that. So I want to ask, maybe the panel can join me and think, why do we still have a stigma? Why do we still worry and sometimes see us different than the people with mental illness? I have my ideas, but maybe.
Theresa?
Breaking down stigma is a community effort, right? Sometimes when it comes to mental illness or any disability, we like to put people in buckets where somehow they're special. And I don't know if that's the case. When it comes to breaking down any stigma, it's up to all of us to be open and to talk about it. So, but something that happens with mental illness, for example, is like, if I get hospitalized for a mental illness, who do I have to share and talk about that with? I get hospitalized and my mom is like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening. And the community doesn't come around her, or my father in the same way as maybe someone who I've been told recently who might have cancer. Right? We just treat people differently, and people then feel afraid to talk about it because maybe the media did play a role. But think about it. 1 in 5 individuals is impacted by a mental illness. Look at this room. 1 in 5 of us know people. All of us probably know someone who's personally been affected by some kind of mental health problem. But all of those people suffer alone because we as a community don't feel comfortable to just say, hey, this is just like anything else. We talk about it. We talk about it openly, and it's not a celebrity thing that they should talk about it and come out and somehow that's special. It's me, it's you, it's a teacher, it's a mentor who just says, you know what, that's great. I support you. What can I do? Bring a casserole? Whatever. And that's kind of how it starts, right? By not looking at that way. Because I think even when we think about housing or employment, the things that make a happy environment in the office for someone with a mental illness is the same thing I want, right? I don't know about you, but I want a good relationship with my boss. I want to feel like the work I'm doing is meaningful. And if I quit, it's not because I'm mentally ill. It may be because I was bored or not challenged. But if the rumors start and someone leaves, it's just too easy to be like, well, that person was crazy. And that's maybe harmful. That's somewhere to think about. Do we want to engage in that kind of conversation?
I just want to add to that another experiment where a number of people were asked to name 3 things that they felt like they need, and they wrote them down. And then they asked him to name 3 things that they thought that people with serious mental illness needed. And they were so different than the things that they wanted. In about 1988, I remember we did a survey in Arlington when we started the clubhouse, Clare House that was mentioned, and what people wanted. And you know what they wanted? 3 things. They wanted a good job.
I knew.
They wanted affordable, decent house, and friends.
A friend.
No different than any of us. And that's how we started the clubhouse, trying to provide those opportunities. And employment also was provided, and that's how the Job Avenue came about, because one good way to empower somebody is to provide assistance to have their own home, a job that they like, and feel free and productive in the community.
You know, I think another thing is that it's not just about education, and I think sort of as society, we think, well, if there's more education about mental illnesses, then immediately stigma will go away. But there's been a lot of research that actually shows that that's not even the case. There was a study in particular that looked at people's kind of understanding that mental illnesses have a biological component, that these are sort of real illnesses. And then, and the improvement made in that space was tremendous. So people get that these are real, legitimate illnesses, that this isn't just people being lazy, et cetera. And then it also asked, well, what about treatment? Are you supportive of the idea of people getting help in treatment? Again, great advances, and it looked at like a 10-year time span. And then it looked at the very things that Jose is talking about, sort of the ways in which we measure stigma through social distance. Well, what about then your willingness to have someone with a mental health issue as a neighbor, as a coworker, marry into the family. And you would expect, right, that with this increased understanding that mental illnesses are real and treatment is out there and a good thing, that you would also say, oh, okay, well then people are ready to have people integrated into their lives. Not the case. In some cases, it actually got worse. And in particular, as a neighbor and workplace, in some cases got worse. So I think it's really telling that it's not just about education, and quite frankly, I think it's about events like tonight where we're really talking about these issues and not just, putting out pamphlets, although that stuff is also very important.
And there are a whole bunch of pamphlets outside too.
And I brought
Grab
them
them on your way out. So we're talking a lot about stigma, and to drill down on employment issues, how does that manifest on the application process when you are employed? What does mental illness do and stigma do for a person?
I want to piggyback on what you said, Claire, because a lot of times setting the stage for a non-discriminatory environment starts with an employer, and it's quite amazing. MHA did some research with employer groups knowing that depression is a serious issue in the workplace. Depression affects a team, it affects absenteeism and productivity, but when we would talk to HR managers or owners of businesses, it's like, oh, wow, those statistics are amazing, and oh, yes, depression affects people, but they don't affect people in our business or in our company, right? So there's a disconnect of acknowledging that this is a problem, and then what do I do about it? Maybe because if I acknowledge that it exists, that I have to do something about it. But guess what? That problem exists and it affects your business. So we should address them, and we should find proactive ways by creating systems that support people, like IEP, EAP programs or other kinds of programs inherent in the business model to help people. And
Can we drill down
a
little bit on the prevalence? You keep touching on it. I know you have a lot of statistics and numbers on that. Cost on businesses and employers.
Yeah, I know that for bipolar disorders, is one of the most expensive illnesses to treat. 45 billion it costs the U.S. in days lost of work. 4 million days of work lost as a result of indirect costs for people with bipolar disorder, and 20 million for low performance, because of the illness. And for depression, the numbers are almost the same. So it's a lot of lost productivity in that respect, and there are other costs associated with that, So it is very high.
Comorbidity is an additional cost, because we know that many people who have physical health problems may also have mental health problems, but when depression gets added to the physical health problem like pain, this actually has a increased effect on the cost of treating that physical illness, and these are costs that do fall on the employer to help pay for as part of insurance that they cover.
I was just going to say, in addition to, the physical health, it's exactly the same as in physical health. If you start intervening earlier, if you catch things early on, you can have that same kind of preventative effect of treating people. The costs are lower, but because healthcare in this country really didn't cover mental health services until fairly recently, there's not the same tradition or awareness really of coming and, yes, this is how you go and you seek treatment, and this is how you can access these services. And then on top of that, there are certain, in the employment context, professional licensing, there are a lot of situations in which you're actually actively discouraged from seeking treatment. I'm a lawyer. If you sit to take the bar here in Virginia, you have to answer a question about whether or not you have sought psychiatric treatment in the past. Yeah. That, in and of itself, discourages people from seeking treatment. Even if the Virginia bar will admit you, just having that question is hugely impactful. Yeah. I know people who have actively put off treatment because they don't want to answer that question, yes. And really, what impact does that have? The bar, I think is a great example because they look into everything about you. They look into your financial history, they run a background check on you. You know, if you have done anything that's gonna set off a red flag, they will know about it. And just having sought treatment, honestly, to go to law school, you probably should seek treatment. You know, like, you know, it should be a big plus that you've actually actively sought out treatment. And I mean, to touch on substance abuse, which is a kind of related condition here, and I think that kind of plays into the stigma and the employment as well, is many people with mental illness of some form or another self-medicate with alcohol or other forms of drugs, and there are some overlapping diagnoses and a lot of times with a substance abuse condition, which is an unfortunate, you know, contributor to the stigmatic effects, I think, of a lot of mental illness. But
Well, I think it's also, a lot of people are self-medicating because they're not wanting to reach out
Exactly.
for help. But if I could just put a, go back to a little bit of what Theresa was talking about with employers. I think that more and more employers, and this is kind of my area of work, is working with employers, and it's interesting how much I think we have really changed. I think part of it is that the insurance benefits are now available so that they're equal to that for medical, surgical, for mental health. But the real challenge is getting people to use them. Huge number, like for example, employee assistance programs. Like 90% of employers have some sort of an employee assistance program. These are free services. They cost nothing. They can be done by telephone. They can help with a range of issues. They're great for that early intervention that you're talking about, Bethany. It can be, you know, I'm having trouble, you know, childcare issues. I mean, incredible amount of huge benefit, free. 3% of people use these free services. And so one of the things that we're seeing is employers are actually wanting to take action and really trying to figure out sort of what to do, but are looking for those programs that really try to get the word out and creating that environment where they're basically saying to employees, listen, we want you to use these services. You're important to us. We've invested in you as an employee. And so I think that's, you know, kind of a very positive step in terms of where we are. And obviously, not every employer is the same, and there's, you know, good guys and bad guys out there, ones that are more interested and invested in this than others. But I think it's a real positive in terms of, you know, what the employer can do to really create that environment where just by having those programs, you're really sending a message that is supportive of employees.
I want to talk from the needs of the users of mental health services that come through our doors. We have served over, you know, 2,000 people since we started our program, and what we hear from them when they first come in, you know, they feel lack of confidence. Think about it, you know, when you hear in the news every day, you know, mental illness, this happened and that happened. I think that really impacts people's confidence and well-being and self-concept. And the things that they need help with is primarily, how do I report my gaps of employment? You know, this is a big concern. How do I tell them that I have a mental illness? Should I tell them? So they need a lot of information. But a lot of it just practical things. Poverty, a lot of our folks live in poverty, let's face it. They live on you know, benefits that, living in Arlington in $500 or $643 is now, or $700, this really doesn't get too far, you know, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, so the standard of living is low. So when they come, they need help with transportation, you know, to even go see employers. So it's a good thing that we have a program that helps with practical things. But what we find, when people get employed and we see a tremendous change in confidence and a well-being, and they want to work more once they start feeling much better. Sometimes we kind of slow them down in the beginning because, you know, we just want to make sure that they really have gained the confidence completely. But those are the practical things that we see often, and there are folks who have education, and yet, you know, they still lack the confidence to go out and apply for jobs, and sometimes they have to lower their standard, and that's very painful. If somebody had a degree and a high-paying job, because they do, and then having to start lower, that's a, you know, so they need a lot of support and empathy when working with our folks, and that's basically what we do. And the good thing is that they're very appreciative, and the kindest people that you have to work with. I was telling Raul earlier that last year I had the honor and the luck to attend to retirement party for some folks that we placed in employment, a long time ago, and they were treated by employers great. They gave them a beautiful retirement party with food, videos, and they sat the persons down and told them how much they love them and how much they're missing and how valuable they were to the job. And I like to see more of that. Can you imagine sitting there? I mean, I don't think I want to get all that, but there are employers that do that, and I encourage other employers to really, make the accommodations because they will get good employees.
And just to piggyback somewhat off of what Jose said, I mean, another factor in this to consider is that, yes, there are a lot of causes for mental health conditions. I mean, it's not just necessarily that you are genetically predisposed to some type of mental health condition. It also can be trauma-induced. I mean, we have a lot of veterans in this country who have mental health conditions. And I mean, one of my favorite things to do when I'm sitting talking to policymakers is to say, when you're talking about the mentally ill, replace mentally ill with a veteran and see how your perception of the situation changes, because that's a very important thing to consider. And it's not just necessarily the trauma in a, that type of a crisis situation, because that would also be relevant for police officers, for firefighters, for anyone who works in a very traumatic environment, but also for those who are in poverty. And I mean, poverty in and of itself is hugely traumatic. And so, of course, you're going to have higher instances of mental health conditions among people who are in poverty. So just an additional factor to kind of play in.
Yeah, that may lead to substance abuse. And you see people that end up incarcerated, a thorough have mental illness, thorough homeless, they have mental illness as well.
I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions, just come on up to the mic and we will call on you. I think our vice chair may have a question.
Right.
My question for the panel is, how can management approach an employee that management thinks may have a mental illness? And also, what role, if any, should concern about the individual's privacy play in the whole picture of dealing with the stigma?
I'll start it, yeah. Okay. So I think it's really important for managers to be careful because of some of the legal issues, and I'm going to throw this very quickly over to the lawyers. But I think it's important in that conversation to talk about how it affects, how whatever you're seeing is affecting their performance. So you're saying, you're talking about observable behaviors and how they're sort of impacting the work, so that it's not something personal, and you're speaking and staying very careful in your role as manager. I think that the best thing that a manager can do, though, is probably a much more proactive thing. I mean, I get that you're going to encounter individual situations that need to be addressed, but if you can create an environment where you're normalizing talking about mental health to your entire population or your entire team, reminding folks about the employee assistance program or other services that are available during times when it's stressful, maybe best case modeling that and saying, hey, I just got some great help from the EAP. I needed to find a place for childcare, day camps, whatever. They offer a range of services, so you're showing it's actually a good thing to use those services. You're creating that environment. But again, that individual intervention, I think you want to be very careful to stay within your manager role, talk about its effect on the work, and then do a referral to employee assistance, working very closely with HR to make sure you're following all the policies and all of that.
If I'm the only lawyer at this table, then I'm going to suggest that you take that question up with your corporate counsel, because
There we go.
sorry, just to cover my butt, I'm not giving legal advice tonight.
I would agree with Claire. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a social worker, and as we help people who struggle with this stuff, it's like, again, it's not about the mental illness per se, because how would you deal with a person who had a sleeping problem maybe was sleeping in very late, right? You would focus on how it affected the job performance, but I might say, ask the person. If you start to sense these problems, hopefully you're having regular reviews and you have job performance measures to help people keep on track about their goals, but what they're supposed to do, and encourage wellness by encouraging them to do their job well. So as their manager, sometimes our managers are our best advocates because they're the first one to kind of say something is not right for whatever reason, physical or mental health related, or just family dynamics. Gosh, forget mental illness, I'm just gonna have a fight with my husband, and maybe I'm just off. So it's like, hey, what's going on? How can I help? Are things, I noticed that maybe you're tired or things are, how can we make changes to support you to do better? Because I know you want to do better. And then if the person says, well, sometimes they don't know that resources exist.
Right, yeah.
To access them, or maybe it is an accommodation, which I know we want to talk about today.
Yeah, so maybe it doesn't need to be this adversarial conversation. It can just be, I notice, you're coming in later, you're missing deadlines, this is unusual, I'm worried about you, is there anything I can do? Lots of open-ended questions, and then having that EAP or whatever information you have available to be supportive, I think there.
And if you're working with, the employer's working with a job coach, that relationship is very good. I can give you a real-life example. This lady was really, going, her productivity was going down and was not doing a good job for a while. And but I had regular visits to the employer. So I said, how is so-and-so doing? And I said, I don't know, she's not doing, what I expect her to do. I don't know what's going on with her. So I said, she really loved this job, and she, we wanted to make it work for you as well, so I'd be happy to talk to her. And what the lady told me, that she thought that the manager didn't like her because she didn't talk to her. And that every time she came around, she got very scared and started making mistakes. So I went back and talked to the manager, and I said, she really loves the job. She wants to work here, and she's afraid she's going to get fired. And she said that she's scared of you because sometimes you don't talk to her. She said, no, I'm just busy. So it was she was interpreted that she didn't like. So she said, I'll talk to her. I like her. So
Right.
the conversation, so she started talking to her. She calls me up. She likes me.
Oh.
I like my job. So I mean, just
great.
very practical
Yeah.
example of working with a job coach can help sometimes. If you have that availability, take advantage of it. It's not always the case, but having a good relationship and talking to people, like you say, ongoing, then doesn't seem like it's a punishment, to address it.
So I'm curious, you touched on this a little bit. So say I'm an employee who is suffering with depression, and I know my work is suffering. My boss is not happy with me, but I know that the depression is part of that. How do I bring that up in the conversation? How do I disclose? How do I disclose? Can I ask for help? What accommodations are available? It's all pretty scary, right? So what do I do?
I can give kind of a general start to this, which is you do have, there are accommodations available. I mean, part of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title I, deals specifically with employment. And employment for people with disabilities is incredibly low. And so the ADA was designed to help address this, because a lot of people still can work but might need an accommodation to some part of their job. For people with mental illness, sometimes it's, I need to sleep in later in the mornings because when my medication hits, it just doesn't quite get worked through my system the right way, and getting into work at 11 and staying until 7 is going to work a lot better for me than it would be. It might be related to communication. If you have an anxiety disorder, it might be something along the lines of just having a bit of a more clear communication discussion, a regular weekly review where the employer is like, yes, you're doing a great job. There are a set of accommodations, and they're available. They're available under the ADA for anyone with a disability. And the mental health, to give you the exact legal term, if you are an individual with a mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, you qualify as an individual with a disability under the ADA, and you can seek a reasonable accommodation, which more or less means as long as it doesn't unduly burden the employer. This isn't supposed to be a hardship for employers. I mean, it can occasionally cost them a little bit of money. For individuals who are blind, they might need assistance with reading machines for their computers, other factors like that. Transportation is actually huge, and that's not usually provided by the employer, but that's an important kind of accommodation sometimes that more or less the feds pick up most of the time. But you know, there are accommodations in all sorts of different ways. For mental health, I'm sure Jose could give us plenty more examples, but those are the ones that I have off the top of my head.
Yes, we definitely address issues such, you know, so we have periodic meetings with folks who we have placed, and if they allowed us to talk to the employers, we do talk to the employer about accommodations ourselves, because sometimes they may not feel very confident. You know, they are afraid that they might going to say the wrong thing, so we do some coaching in that area. But I do agree with you about you know, exercising the rights and requesting changes in the environment if it's sometimes depression comes with alteration in thinking. And sometimes I remember someone used to get worried when somebody used to cough. When they did that, she felt that they were doing it on purpose. So, you know, those little things like that, you know, can really impact someone's mental health because their alteration in thinking. So sometimes shifting the work environment, maybe moving to a quiet, another place and moving their equipment to do their work could be an accommodation that is reasonable as long as it's not a hardship on the employer. Because if you request something extravagant and costly, the employer can also say, you know, that's something that I can afford to do.
But the process is really scary because you're asking for a change, something different than the rest of the process. And I know that there are quite a few federal resources. ODEP, the Office of Disability Employment Policy, has an entire website devoted to this. There are services like Jose's, although a little bit different, that kind of specifically focus on accommodations. But I'll turn it over to you guys for
I'm just going to add, there's a great resource that's available both to individuals and to employers called the Job Accommodation Network, and it's funded, I think, through ODEP. And it has, you can look up by specific conditions, all different ways, and get free advice on, you know, specific accommodation ideas. I think it might be good for us to talk about the issue of disclosure. And you know, when I think about disclosure, I think about, like, what would I say if a friend asked me, should I disclose? And I think there's no right answer, and I think it really depends on the individual and sort of, and what I always go back to is, what are you actually trying to accomplish? Like, unfortunately, we live in a really messy world, and I think that the way that we're going to reduce stigma is by having more and more people talk about their own personal experience. But in an individual situation, I think you can work in an environment where it's not going to be received well, and so you want to be very thoughtful about why you're disclosing, how you're disclosing, sort of what that's going to look like, plan it in advance. This is not the kind of thing you want to kind of wing and just do. So maybe it's, you know, you're recognizing that, as Jose says, sometimes depression comes with cognitive challenges. Maybe you're having trouble concentrating, et cetera. So you might approach your manager with, here's what I'm experiencing. I need a little bit of flexibility. I have a plan in place. Here's what I'd like to, you know, propose that we do. I'd like to have a little flexibility for some appointments, move my schedule around a little bit. I'd like to have maybe move to a different workspace so that I can concentrate a little bit more, so that you're showing that you have a plan in place and you want this to work and you're a committed employee. I think would sort of be like the best case for how you would navigate that.
And notice you didn't say anything about what your diagnosis was or
Right.
why, just
Right.
that you were having trouble concentrating,
Right.
which honestly can be enough under the ADA. Your employer does have to know that you have a disability and that you need an accommodation in order to comply with the law. But, you know, you can frame it as, I'm having trouble concentrating, you know.
In some situation, you may decide whether you want to disclose getting the job, you know, and that's a hard one, because we work with folks who have legal problems. Maybe they use substance abuse and they have records.
Criminal records are a huge issue.
And, or they have other, you know, substance abuse histories, assaults and things like that. And they have the skills to do a certain job, and that's the most painful thing, to see someone who has rehabilitated, they cannot apply because the applications that they have to fill out specifically ask, and they ask, should I lie or not lie? I said, you know, it's up to you, but the best thing is to be honest. How can we go about it? And believe it or not, there are more employers that will hire people with records than you may think. A lot of times, I think people, well, I have a record, and that's sometimes they decide not to work, but with some education they do. And what has helped some of the folks that we work with, I mean, with their permission, that we write a letter saying that, yes, long time ago, this happened to me, and now I'm in rehabilitation. I have been working on this, and have something to show the employer. And the good thing, if they do get hired, they're free from the fear of being discovered, because the other thing, if they lie, then a lot of times people don't want to tell the truth because they're afraid they're not going to get hired, and they do alter the truth, and what happens is worse. They get found out, and then they get dismissed from the work. So it is an advantage to be hired from an employer who really accepts you and believes you. And there are employers that do that, but I'm not with the help of the user, mental health user.
Another factor there might be a financial history, bankruptcy for jobs that run credit checks. Because, I mean, it can be someone who's been doing fine for years and has an advanced degree, but then at that point, they could lose the house, go through a bankruptcy, and then you have a credit check as part of a job application. Things that you don't necessarily think about that actually have a pretty disparate impact on people with mental illness.
So especially if the application you put down there, so a good explanation is worth doing. That's what I need to mention.
Stories are powerful, you know, as you're interviewing people, how do you tell that story? That's basic interviewing skills, and it's, but it can be a source of strength. So overcoming something like a mental health problem or any kind of illness is seen as a strength. And I do feel like more and more employers who are supportive understand that. And we hope that over time, because people do understand that, and we as a society understand that as a whole, that people will feel more comfortable to share some of the stories. None of the stories are anything that you have to disclose because it's protected, and it goes to whether you're seeking accommodation at the office or maybe you just need some time off. It's up to any person how they disclose whatever reason they need to take time off, right? All you need is the doctor's notice. It doesn't need to explain anything about why you were there or what you're needing. But if we all feel comfortable sharing and not feeling stigmatized about these issues, then we start to see that people who overcome this have immense strength and contribution in the workplace or your neighbor.
On that note, I want to offer something. Oh.
Is there time for a question?
Yes, come on up to the mic, please. Really quickly. We have to be at the mic so that it gets recorded, so if you have a question, come on up.
Thank you, great panel so far. I don't know if any of you had a chance to look at the Arlington County Human Rights Ordinance at all about mental impairment, yes, no? But I was just perusing it before and during. The code prohibits certain discriminatory acts against handicapped folks, and then it breaks it down into physical impairments and mental impairments. Purposely excluded in the code for mental impairments includes existing, they carve out alcoholism, looks like substance abuse, and strangely enough, certain mental impairments that have been used as a positive defense for asserted as a criminal defense. So I was just wondering if the panel had any comments on this. Is this something that the commission may want to approach current board members and possible future board members to change, and just any other comments and thoughts? Thanks.
Before you answer, this is actually, it's so funny because we didn't plan this. I was just about to share something very personal, but it's related. And most, all my commissioners know this, but if you don't, then I'm pretty public about it. I have 10 years of sobriety. I'm an alcoholic, very public about that. I do a lot of volunteer work with Lawyer Assistance Program. I also suffer from depression. And the interesting thing for me, I got sober during law school, and so I went through the bar application process, and because I got help, it wasn't a problem. It wasn't an obstacle. I have no problem being open about my alcoholism. It is really hard to talk about depression. It is really hard to ask for help at work for depression. And I just think that's a fascinating statement that James made about the ordinance and the different things we're talking about and how different mental illness can be from some of these other things. So run with that.
Well, and I mean, they are very different, although most substance abuse conditions are also in the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual for most mental health conditions. They are, however, also excluded from the ADA, and I don't know if that's what the ordinance was based on. I'm afraid I didn't have a chance to look at it before I came in, but they are also excluded from the ADA. There has been a general background in this country of not giving the same kind of protections to substance abuse, despite the fact that I feel like many people are more comfortable being open about their substance abuse histories, and we have in a weird way, society is much more accepting. So I don't have an explanation for why that is. I would say that substance abuse conditions are equally as damaging in many ways, and I personally would see no reason to not include them in a protection part.
Yeah.
Could be that,
Yeah.
just like in the old days, we used to see mental illness in biblical times and in the Middle Ages as a personal problems, so it's not, it's still, there is some stigma associated that is a personal problem when it's really an illness, and what determines an illness is that if you don't treat it, it gets worse. And mental illness, substance abuse, if you don't treat it,
It gets worse.
It gets worse, so that's one of the definitions,
I think it has to do with the illicit nature. I think that's the piece that's problematic, and whether or not you're still using substances and the protections that accompany that. And so there's, very specific things around what you can do with testing for drugs, for example, but I think that's the stickiness is, alcohol versus illicit substances. It's my understanding of the
So for
issue.
anyone paying attention to the program, I think I got the nod that we may not do our pairs discussion instead because it's such a nice little group here and the mic is right there. If you have questions, we want you to come on up, and we're just going to keep rolling through our agenda here. But please, questions are encouraged. So there are a couple more things. Oh, here we go. We have a question.
Okay, how do you see mental illness playing out in child custody disputes with the courts, if anybody is able to comment on that? Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit
Yeah.
more about what you mean in terms of child custody?
No, but if one, do you see it very often where the parent or the partner trying to gain child custody might use or exploit mental illness on the part of the other parent to gain custody, retain custody, that type of thing, or is it not typically an issue or used as a weapon? I remember seeing a TV show not long ago where there was that type of allegation, and so I'm just wondering if that is a real world phenomenon very much.
Absolutely.
We've had cases on this very point. It's actually a cross-disability issue in a lot of ways. Mental illness, because of the stigma associated with it, is a particularly impactful disability when it comes to child custody. People have had their children taken away simply on the basis of having a mental illness.
And when it comes to child welfare protection, we sometimes find that families don't have as many rights when it comes to come into family court that they might have in other courts, right? But these are courts that literally break apart families. So it's very concerning because just because you have depression or just because you have a mental illness doesn't make you a bad parent. But certainly systems use the mental health previous treatment or current treatment to maybe justify why they're going to split up a family. And we've definitely dealt with situations where one parent will use the prior history of treatment against their partner to argue why that parent is an unfit parent. And there's not enough regulation that's standardized across counties and states and the federal government to protect against that. And so what you find is, I mean, I've worked in California, North Carolina, Virginia, that every court system is different, just depending on the interpretation of the law, the state that, and how far they're willing to go and to protect, or sometimes just the county and the judge, and how much we're willing to include supports in the system and in the family court system to ensure that maybe family reunification or family system staying together is what we uphold more than anything else, and that it's not splitting the family up that's ideal, because we know that more often than not, splitting a family up is actually really harmful, and the government is not a very good parent, that it's better to keep that family together and give them supports. If we certainly have talked to other national organizations to figure out how we can include protections so that partners can't use mental illness as a discriminatory factor in improving unfit parenting. But those are battles that are slow and that we certainly want to see happen.
It's also an issue with adoption. People with psychiatric histories have a lot of trouble adopting. It's the same, again, it's a cross-disability issue, but people with diabetes or a history of cancer also are generally seen as adoption agencies are more hesitant to adopt to. And that's something that, doesn't often make the news, but is a big deal. Sorry.
So I am a small business owner here in Arlington, and so impressed am I by all I've heard. I now want to be more inclusive in my workplace. Are there any best practices as an employer?
She read our outline, I think, because that's the next question.
Could suggest to me?
Go see Jose. Jose,
definitely we want to hear about the Job Avenue and everyone, let's just go for it.
I can come to visit you tomorrow. and we can talk about best practices, but I think when I started doing this kind of work, I remember I used to beg employers to hire this person. We had TEPs at the time, and if they don't show up, I'll come and cover for them. But now things have changed. We know that people can do the work, and we want to give you good employers, and you should not lower the standard because somebody has mental illness. Making an accommodation doesn't mean you have to lower the standard of the work.
Right.
We expect them to do the work. You want to have employers that do the job. So in terms of...
I think my question really is more about, are there employers that really exhibit this best practice behavior, particularly here in the county? I live here in Arlington, so I want to know, are there employers you're working with, or any of you, that have best practices?
Workplace wellness programs, perhaps?
Yeah.
Whatever they are, I'm not sure.
Scientifically proven, I don't know, I don't have any data, but I can tell you we have employers that join our activities at our program. Like this Christmas, we had an employer who came and brought food and sat with us during our Christmas event, and it was so empowering. And think about it, how comfortable the clients will feel working for this employer. He came and he stayed the whole time, and he didn't have to. He said, "I'm coming to bring the food, but I want to stay. I want to spend time with you." So that was a good best practice, in my opinion, not scientifically.
Mm-hmm. So, and my program works to do just that, to work to identify examples of what companies are doing that is working well, and then telling those stories. So we have, everything that we do is free for employers. So we have a newsletter, we have a database of employer examples. So you could go and look at your industry type, look at your company size, and then get ideas. Each issue of our publication features a different company and what they've done. The recent one featured a company, and the way that they really changed their leadership style to be much more person-centric. They noticed that they had a lot of policies in place that were really just, people would come into work and they'd be happy, lots of camaraderie, and then as soon as they clocked in, there's sort of like the energy went out in the room, and there were all these specific reasons, like their tools were locked up, and so the assumption was that, you know, they were going to steal the tools, and I can't remember all the other specifics. So they changed a lot of just the way that the work, you know, was arranged, and, you know, radically did things differently to really empower individuals, to show their employees that they care, et cetera. I could go on, clearly. We also have a couple of free programs that are available to you. One I'll talk about is called I See You. It's a program that DuPont, the big you know, chemical company in Wilmington, developed, rolled out globally to all of their you know, locations around the world, and then they gave it to our organization to make it available to other companies. And so it's called I See You, and it plays on the analogy of intensive care unit, but also I see SEEU as another human being in the workplace. It's a 5-minute video, basically teaches people a little bit about emotional distress and encourages employees to reach out to one another that are struggling. So you talked about, you know, what can a manager do? This is taking a different kind of avenue, if you will, and encouraging employees just to reach out to one another. And it's okay to actually say to somebody, you don't seem like yourself, are you okay? So that's one, you know, example of a free program that you could use. And again, I think there's some real power in an employer just doing any of these things. You know, talking about mental health as the CEO sends such a powerful message. You know, sometimes we work a lot with HR folks who do great work, but to have a CEO give these messages, it's another, you know, it's another whole ball game. So, bravo.
And just promoting psychological well-being as a whole, so not about mental illness, but every employer. So if you can imagine that if we were all happy employees and that all happy employees are productive and work well, what kind of environment do you want to work in that would make you happy and want to come to work? And how do I create that? Or what practices am I engaging in that don't create that? Is it hostile? Is it punitive? Do people go into the office? Do they close doors? Are people not talking to one another? Do they feel like they're replaceable? So if I think we hear the same things from employees and employers. Everybody wants someone to feel like they're productive, engaged, and employers want to stay in their job. They want to keep their job, and employers want to retain employees. So the same practices exist, I think, for both sides, but how do you encourage that, both from the top and down and bottom up? And I think that's creating a culture, right? Mm-hmm. That's evaluating your culture and creating a culture of psychological well-being.
And some of the programs that Claire mentioned are in the handouts, I
Yes.
believe, that are right outside the door, and the website is very extensive, so please take a look. Let's take a question, and then we're going to shift to housing, because I do want to touch on that a bit. So, question.
Yeah, actually, my question is kind of related to both employment and housing. I kind of wanted to back up. I was really interested in all of the resources that were mentioned at the beginning, such as the Job Avenue and Clarendon House and any kind of affordable housing programs in Arlington. I personally live in Washington, D.C., and I'm coming here trying to see what the differences are. And one of the things I found is, you know, some of the programs in D.C., such as like Green Door, you call them and you say, oh, you know, I know someone who needs assistance, getting employment, blah, blah, blah. And the first question was, are they on Medicaid? Or we're not taking people. So I guess, you know, this all sounds great, but what are the eligibility requirements for a person who's seeking help? I mean, do they have to be a person who, again, like, for example, is on Medicaid, or like, what are the eligibility requirements for all of these things?
I can answer that. In Arlington, the only requirement is that you meet the disability criteria for mental health in our program, and that you live in Arlington. So that's the basic. But insurance is not an issue. It's not even asked. That's not something that is part of the intake criteria.
Is there anyone else in the audience that wants to speak to some of the Arlington-specific programs? I know we have some staff or county board. If not, we can direct you to resources, I'm sure. But our folks on the panel know the answer.
And I'd love to take a stab at nationally
yes.
looking at that question.
I did bring a pamphlet for Behavioral Healthcare Division that lists all the programs and the referral procedures, phone numbers, everything.
Okay.
So make sure you get it.
Bethany?
And just, I'm actually really, really glad to hear that, because that's not generally the case. I would say that nationally, a lot of the job services for people with serious mental illness are Medicaid funded, or they're funded through the state VR combined with Medicaid, and it gets very complicated. When it comes to housing, and I mean, affordable housing is a problem across the country. For people with serious mental illness who have been homeless or are Medicaid eligible, it's a slightly easier path, because generally then they're income eligible for other subsidized housing options, Section 8 through HUD, which is available in all states, or programs like that. But when you kind of hit that mid-range, that middle income level where you have a little bit of money but not enough, you lose access to a lot of the services. I mean, in a lot of ways, Medicaid is one of the best payers for mental health services in the United States, because they fund evidence-based practices that, honestly, private insurance doesn't cover. Yeah. If you ask somebody who had a child with mental illness what healthcare program they would want to be a part of, I can pretty much guarantee you every parent would tell you Medicaid, because they have some of the best services available. And
it's a policy issue that's short-sighted, that for the advocates who kind of straddle this place where we recognize the strength of the public system in taking care of people, and then see this gap where people aren't eligible because of income, it's concerning. So we try to find strategies to extend the availability of these programs for people who don't meet that income eligibility, because it's a serious barrier. And that is it's going to take the federal and the state government to open that benefit up, to recognize that that's the better thing to do, because by treating these people and opening that up, you're going to prevent them from falling into this space where it's going to be much more costly. It's ridiculous that people come to our door looking for help, and we literally have to say, well, I'm sorry, we have to wait for you to get more sick or more poor for you to access a service. It's really short-sighted. And I think that Bethany and MHA and many of the other advocates would say we were trying to figure out a way to change that practice.
I mean, parity was great because it opened up a lot. I mean, mental health parity, I think, has gotten into the public consciousness that, now private insurance has to cover a lot more mental health services. But a lot of the services that help people with mental illness are peer support services. I mean, like in Alcoholics Anonymous, having people who've gone through the same thing before, who have heard voices before, who can sit and have that conversation with you. Yes, I understand what you're going through. That is invaluable. And that's not really something private insurance covers. But Medicaid covers it in almost all 50 states.
Yeah, so we're, if you feel like you want to have access to a service and you're trying to figure out, okay, what service do I want? It's powerful for us to have community members step up and support the advocacy agenda to say that's not fair. This should be that private insurance companies and the system itself should allow for these best practices to be provided for anybody, because there is a need, not because of arbitrary eligibility that was decided.
And in preparing for this panel, I know I had a conversation with a bunch of you about what are we talking about here tonight? Are we talking about those who are on Medicaid or Medicare or whatever, and those who are in that gap? And because it's a different process. It's a very different process and a very different conversation. And so as we switched to housing, that was a big thing we had to decide is what are we going to talk about? And we're talking about those folks who aren't necessarily in public housing. So I do want to hear from folks about how mental illness can impact obtaining and maintaining your housing.
So I can give a little bit of a background here. I mean, a lot of the same issues we talked about in employment. I mean, it's far more likely when you're applying for housing, you're going to have to be subject to a credit check, for instance. I've applied for several apartments here in Arlington, and there's always been a credit check as part of that. If you've had a crisis in the past that's led to some financial complications, that's going to be an issue. The same type of criminal background checks, that's less common in housing, but it does happen occasionally. Those are kind of the ways in the application process that it can come up. Do you want to add anything?
Well, and just like a job, you have to show up, right? So the strange thing about mental illness is not an illness that's like a physical disability. So people can't see mental illness. It might be harder for someone to discriminate against you on the front end because of a mental illness, but you get caught up in other ways, like income, like proof of income, or past experiences with your previous landlord. Have you been evicted before? These are things that kind of come up for people with serious mental illness often, that we have to navigate or figure out how to help people to figure out as they are trying to apply for an apartment or housing unit. And that's separate from Section 8 or availability of voucher programs, which are, the wait lists are horribly long to get into, so that's really difficult anyways.
And, another situation could be neighbors not having taking offense to some things. I've had clients in the past who have been up at odd hours of the night because their illness manifests in certain sleep problems.
Yeah.
And your neighbors are not going to want you playing music at 3 a.m. in the morning, but maybe that's, something that you need to do at this point.
Yeah. So in terms of an accommodation, it's similar where, again, it can't cause burden on the property unit. So, being late on your rent is probably not something you can do just because you have a mental health problem. You want to be preemptive. You want to try and plan. We talk to people about what's your plan? How do you pay your rent? We all worry about paying our rent on time, but if you happen to have to go to the hospital, are you on a computerized payment plan where your rent's just going to be paid? Because if you don't pay your rent, your landlord can take steps to take action against you. That's not an accommodation, but an accommodation might be, maybe I can't pay the rent because the way that the landlord wants me to. They say I have to go in person to pay the rent, but I can't do that because maybe I have a mental health problem that doesn't let me get outside my room. A reasonable accommodation should be that I get to mail in my rent, right? Ideally, it's computerized, so it just goes in every month. That way, regardless, your rent's paid. But these are examples of reasonable accommodations, and oftentimes, your right to quiet enjoyment and having a quiet environment can butt up against something that's going on where I've not done well and there's a loud fighting match or something is happening. And when that comes up, your landlord has a right to say, hey, that's not cool. They may take steps to evict you, but if you know that this is happening because I just let things go and you have a mental health problem, you can get assistance from Virginia, even, who have mediation services through the county, to get some support, legal support, to say, can you help step in and mediate the situation? If you show that you can take steps to change that and you're not harming anybody, this is the key, there's no imminent harm or danger to persons, your landlord should give you some leeway. And allow for supports for you to deal with those issues.
I know that Tiffany asked me to speak about this as well. Animals involved in this process. Some people with psychiatric disabilities have psychiatric service dogs, or they might have other emotional support animals. Two different legal regimes. This is something that not a lot of people know, but the ADA applies to service animals, which are defined in statute as service dogs or service miniature horses. long story about why that's the case, but service dogs are an ADA accommodation, universally accepted everywhere. If you live in a house, if you rent an apartment, your service dog can live with you, even if the apartment complex has rules to the alternative. Emotional support animals fall in a different category under the Fair Housing Act. And there are slightly different rules there, but it's the same kind of accommodation. I mean, if you want to have an emotional support animal that's not particularly disruptive, then that's fine. Generally speaking, I think it's a pretty reasonable accommodation to exempt them from a no pets policy. But it would be it would depend somewhat on the circumstances, because there are, we're trying to find a balance here.
You should get it.
Well, I do know of a couple of other
It is now
places.
8:30. The library closes in 30 minutes. Restrooms in the second floor will close at 8:55. The checkout desk in the garage closes promptly at 9 p.m. Thank you.
So they kick us out at 9. But we're going to go a teensy bit over, Kitty, a teensy bit over. But we're pretty close to on track here. Is there anything else? I know we're kind of breezing through housing here, but is there anything else anyone else on the panel wants to say about housing? No?
It's the same thing with employment. I mean, my favorite thing about housing is if you have a Jose, and I've been Jose for housing, is as a case manager or someone who's supporting someone, I'm building a relationship with my landlord. So my landlords can be an advocate for me. Like, they keep an eye on how things are going, and they're also a support. My landlords sometimes live in the same building. They want to keep their tenants. They want their tenants to pay rent, and they want everybody to be happy and living in a happy environment. So it's the same kind of rules apply. If you are a person who is struggling and you feel comfortable, building a relationship with your landlord can be great, because they're also great neighbors. They can come and help you fix your place, and they can also just be in communication with your case management team to provide support. Sometimes our landlords are the first people who kind of trigger for us, like, hey, our landlords call us and go, you guys need to come over, because we're on an ACT team or a 24-hour service, and we'll respond immediately. So building that relationship is really helpful in times where things might not be going well, or things might fall through the cracks.
So
Housing is one of the most important services for people with serious mental illness. I mean, going back to something Jose referenced, like, when you ask people with serious mental illness what they want, a job, housing, and friends. Like, it's pretty basic. It's what everybody else, I think, in this room would want at a basic level.
Our basic needs.
So we've covered, I think, what folks' rights are in this area. I don't know that we have to go over them, but if you feel like you've been discriminated against in the application process for an accommodation, or for retribution for seeking an accommodation, what do you do?
The EEOC has an office in Arlington and Fairfax. Wherever the discrimination occurred, I'm currently helping someone who got dismissed from the job because they didn't want to say no to a union vote. Oh. So she got dismissed, and they were claiming that the person was disrespectful because when they were mean to her, she was mean back to them. So she's filing, so there are places where they can file.
And maybe the Human Rights Commission?
Yes.
Yeah. In Arlington.
Housing
Yes.
division of Arlington.
This was in Fairfax, by the way.
Okay.
The
I should
EEOC
note
has
that-
a great,
I was just going to say that we have pamphlets in English and Spanish about the commission right outside the door that folks should grab on their way out. Bethany? The EEOC has?
the EEOC has a great, has a complaint system. And if you have been discriminated at work, they also have a lot of resources that could put you in touch with attorneys, which is generally how this ends up going for that. On the public side, where you have people who fall into the public system, legal aid services, here in Virginia, Disability Rights Virginia, is not called Disability Rights Virginia, but the P&A here in Virginia is great, and they can help you with both housing and employment. Again, we have a slightly different set of services depending on where you fall.
In Arlington, there are a bunch of county services that are actually really great. So I know there's a housing division that does offer mediation services if you have housing problems.
So unless we have more questions, anyone? Raise your hand now. Jared?
I just have one quick question. Earlier we talked about some of the problems that an employer or manager might have when they feel like one of their employees might be going through some sort of illness. But the other thing we talked about is that mental illness sometimes transcends work level, socioeconomic background, all these sorts of things. And a possible, even more difficult situation could be if you feel like one of your superiors or employers may have mental illness that may have developed even after they reach that level within their company or business or whatnot. So just curious, any kind of experience you've had with that, what kind of recommendation you might have for someone who feels like their work is being made more difficult because of the situation.
It's when we've talked to people about a psychologically healthy workplace, many times people talk about the psychological non-well-being is created by supervisors or bullying experiences that occur sometimes in the workplace. And that's hard because as an employee, what is your right or what do you do to navigate when your superior is the person who is maybe just not being kind. I mean, you can postulate maybe they have a mental health problem or whatnot, but that's a problem that we often see, and I think that's why it's important to have a conversation with people who are higher up about the kind of environment they are creating, and if people above them support an environment that is psychologically well, then it opens up the venue for, regardless of where the dialogue starts, something can be done, right? But I know you also have a program, so let me let Claire speak since
Yeah, I mean, with that, I think it's a case where you would need to go to human resources and really talk about that. And then the other suggestion I would have is to call the Employee Assistance Program. And there could be, why are you laughing at that?
It's like the 800 times talked about the employees.
I know, but it's true, they're free. Nobody uses them. So it's my one-woman mission to get the word out about these free programs. But seriously, they can help the individual navigate that kind of situation because their expertise is mental health in the workplace. So it's a perfect issue to bring to them. And then sometimes EAP companies will have that relationship with the employer. So you could avoid HR by talking to the EAP, and the EAP can intervene with the company to, bring these problems, and sometimes that will routinely happen. The Employee Assistance Program might be receiving lots of complaints from a particular business unit, and then would feed that information, protecting everyone's privacy. But listen, we're seeing a lot of concerns with this particular business unit. You might need to look into that.
So we do have to wrap up, but I do want to just give a very short couple sentence to each of you, closing thoughts. Where do we go from here? I know some of you wanted to talk about that, just briefly. Jose?
Yes, I want to say that fortunately Arlington County has wonderful employees, people that are ready to work, and they are good workers. So we have a lot of people working in the community. We are looking for employers who want to give opportunities for folks with who are users of mental health services, but also I also think it's important that decision makers continue to provide safety net for folks with mental health issues to help them get back into the workplace, to help them keep the jobs so they can be and continue to be productive and happy members of our community.
And I guess my closing thought would be that there's lots of free programs that are available, and everyone could play a role in the room by going back to their employer and suggesting that they implement a program to raise awareness about mental health and begin to create that environment where people can reach out for help when they need it.
I want to just say thank you for having this dialogue is a beginning of changing stigma in a system. So hopefully something occurred here that inspires you to just start that conversation whenever you see it in your community.
And I would echo everything Theresa just said. Thanks so much. I mean, this is literally what kind of breaks down those stigmatic barriers, and it's so important. So thank everybody.
it over to our chair, Ms. Kitty.
All right, thank you. Wasn't this a wonderful experience? Aw. I think we need to do this again. Okay? We got your numbers.